A Boston police officer, face down in the snow, frozen, barely breathing, his girlfriend kneeling over him, screaming. By 7:50 that morning, he was dead. And by that same afternoon, before the autopsy, before the forensics, before anyone had finished asking questions, the lead investigator had already decided who did it. He texted his friends about it. He called her a whack job. He said she was, quote, F*** edition. He said there was zero chance she skates. The man who wrote those texts was the detective assigned to find the truth. His name was Michael Proctor. And what he did next, what they all did next, would become one of the most explosive police corruption stories in the history of Massachusetts law enforcement. This is the Karen Read story. And I promise you, by the time this video ends, you will understand why half of America put on a pink shirt and stood outside a courthouse demanding justice for a woman they had never met. Stay with me. Before we get to the night everything fell apart, you need to understand who Karen Read actually was. Because this is not a story about a reckless, unstable woman who snapped in a moment of drunk rage. This is a story about a woman who, by every measurable standard, had built an extraordinary life. Karen Read grew up in Taunton, Massachusetts. She went to Bentley University, not once, but twice. A bachelor's degree in finance, then a master's. She built a career as a financial analyst at Fidelity Investments, one of the largest investment firms in the world, where she worked for 15 years. She also taught as an adjunct professor at Bentley. She was not on the margins of society. She was not a woman in crisis. She was accomplished, educated, and by all accounts, completely in love with a Boston police officer named John O'Keefe. John was everything a city like Boston produces at its best. 16 years on the Boston Police Department. A graduate of Northeastern University with a master's in criminal justice. And a man who, after his sister and brother-in-law died within a year of each other in 2013 and 2014, took in their 2 children and raised them as his own. That was John O'Keefe. That was the man Karen Read loved. They had met back in 2004, drifted apart, found each other again in 2020 during the early months of COVID, reconnecting over Facebook the way so many people found old connections during that strange, isolated time. By January 2022, they had been together for 2 years. Their relationship, like most real relationships, was not without tension. Prosecutors would later describe it as increasingly troubled. The defense would call that characterization deliberate and misleading. What is not disputed is this. On the night of January 28, 2022, they went out together. And by the morning of January 29th, John O'Keefe was dead. What happened in between is where this story tears itself apart. The night started like many winter nights in a Boston suburb. Karen and John met friends for drinks at C.F. McCarthy's bar in Canton. Around 11 p.m., the group moved across the street to the Waterfall Bar and Grill. It was there they ran into Brian Albert, a fellow Boston police officer and friend of John's, and his wife Nicole. The bar was closing. Brian Albert invited the group back to his house at 34 Fairview Road, where his son was celebrating his 23rd birthday. Security footage shows Karen and John leaving together at 12:11 a.m. They drove to 34 Fairview Road and arrived at 12:24 a.m. Here is where the 2 versions of this story split completely, and they never come back together. The prosecution's version. Karen and John had been arguing that night. Karen dropped John at the house, never let him out of the car, and in a moment of drunk fury, reversed her Lexus SUV into him, left him in the snow to die, then drove home. The defense's version. John went inside the house. Something happened in there. An altercation, a dog attack, a beating, and John O'Keefe was placed back on that front lawn, already dying, while Karen Read was at home, asleep, completely unaware. Both versions agree on one thing. What Karen Read did next. She called him 53 times. Between the time she said she dropped him off and the time she went back to find him, 53 unanswered calls. She left voicemails. Angry ones. The kind of voicemails people leave when they're scared the person they love is ignoring them, or with someone else. You're a fing pervert, she said in one. You're fing another girl. You're AF ****ing loser. Prosecutors played those voicemails in court. They were supposed to sound like evidence of motive. To many people listening, they sounded like a woman who had no idea her boyfriend was already dying in the snow. Because at 4:30 a.m., when Karen Read woke up and realized John still wasn't home, she didn't run. She didn't hide. She called his niece. She called a friend. And she went back to 34 Fairview Road to find him. At around 6 a.m., Karen Read, alongside Jennifer McCabe, Brian Albert's sister-in-law, found John O'Keefe's body face down in the snow on the front lawn. Karen Read tried to save his life. She would later say, through tears, I tried to save his life at 6 in the morning. I was covered in his blood. I was the only one trying to save his life. John O'Keefe was pronounced dead at 7:50 a.m. at the hospital. The cause of death, blunt force trauma to the head and hypothermia. And within hours, Before the day was even over, the investigation into Karen Red had already begun. Not into what happened inside 34 Fairview Road. Not into who else was there that night. Into Karen Red. Only Karen Reed. The man who led that investigation was Massachusetts State Trooper Michael Proctor. And here is where this story stops being a tragedy and starts being something else entirely. Proctor was assigned as the lead homicide investigator. His job, his only job, was to follow the evidence wherever it went, without fear or favor. Instead, 16 hours into the investigation, before the autopsy had even been completed, Proctor was on his phone, not reviewing evidence, not interviewing witnesses, texting his friends. In those texts, he called Karen Red a, quote, whack job CT. He said she was, quote, F** edition. He said there was, quote, zero chance she skates. He joked about going through her phone for naked pictures. He told his own sister that he hoped Karen Red would kill herself. These were not vague, off-color remarks. These were the private communications of the man who was simultaneously deciding what evidence to collect, which witnesses to interview, and what theory of the crime to pursue. And it gets worse. Proctor shared confidential details of the investigation with people who had no business knowing them. He had a personal connection to the Albert family, the family whose house John O'Keefe's body was found outside. That connection was never disclosed. The prosecution never called Proctor to testify in the retrial. Think about that for a moment. In a murder case, they did not call their own lead investigator to the stand. Because they knew that if Alan Jackson, Karen Reed's attorney, got Proctor in that chair, it would be over. Defense attorney Alan Jackson said it plainly in his opening statement. He called Proctor a cancer, his word, that had infected every single part of this case from the very beginning. In March 2025, Michael Proctor was dishonorably discharged from the Massachusetts State Police. The disciplinary board found him guilty of sending derogatory, defamatory, and disparaging messages about Red, sharing confidential investigation details with outsiders, and consuming alcohol while on duty. He was fired. The lead investigator in a murder case. Fired for his conduct in that exact investigation. And Karen Reed had already been on trial for 3 years. But the corruption question was only one half of what made this case so explosive. The other half was the evidence itself, and what the defense said had been done to it. The prosecution's physical case rested on two things: a broken taillight from Karen Reed's Lexus SUV, pieces of which were found near John O'Keefe's body, and the argument that those pieces proved her car had struck him. Karen Reed's defense team picked that argument apart piece by piece. First, the dog. Brian Albert, the owner of 34 Fairview Road, had a German Shepherd. Expert testimony argued that some of O'Keefe's injuries were consistent with a dog bite, specifically, deep lacerations that did not match the pattern you would expect from a car strike. Second, the Google search. At 2:27 a.m. on the morning of January 29th, Jennifer McCabe, Brian Albert's sister-in-law, the same woman who helped Karen Red find the body, performed a Google search. She searched for, how long to die in cold. 2:27 a.m. More than 3 hours before John O'Keefe's body was found. The prosecution argued the timestamp was misleading, that it only indicated when a browser tab was opened, not when the search was made. The defense argued it was exactly what it looked like, a search made by someone who already knew there was a man dying in the snow outside. Third, the snowplow driver. A man named Brian Loughran drove a snowplow past 34 Fairview Road multiple times in the early morning hours. He testified he passed between 2:40 and 2:45 a.m., and despite it being dark and snowing heavily, he could clearly see the front lawn. He did not see a body. If John O'Keefe had been struck by Karen Reed's car at 12:24 a.m., he would have been lying in that yard for over 2 hours by the time the snowplow passed. And the driver saw nothing. And then there was the phone call. Shortly after Karen Reed's arraignment in February 2022, her attorney David Yannetti received an anonymous call from a man who said he had a background in Boston law enforcement. The caller alleged that Brian Albert and his nephew Colin had beaten O'Keefe inside the house, and that Brian Albert and a federal agent had dragged the body back outside. That caller was later identified. He was a local private investigator named Stephen Scanlon. He gave a formal statement to authorities confirming everything he had told Yannetti. Nobody inside that house was ever formally investigated. By the time the first trial began in April 2024, the Karen Red case had become something that true crime cases almost never become, a genuine national movement. Her supporters wore pink at her request. They lined the courthouse steps every single day. Celebrities posted about her. Legal commentators debated her case on primetime television. A federal investigation was opened into the Norfolk County District Attorney's Office. People who had never followed a true crime case in their lives were following this one, because it didn't feel like a question of whether Karen Red had killed someone in a moment of rage. It felt like a question of whether the entire system, the police, the prosecutors, the investigators, had decided to sacrifice an innocent woman to protect their own. The first trial lasted 9 weeks. The jury deliberated for 5 days. They could not agree. A mistrial was declared on July 1st, 2024. The prosecution announced they would try her again. And so it started all over. The second trial began in April 2025. 31 days of testimony. 49 witnesses. The same evidence. The same arguments. But this time, without Michael Proctor on the stand for the prosecution. The jury deliberated for 4 days. On June 18, 2025, Karen Reed walked out of Norfolk Superior Court a free woman. Not guilty of second-degree murder. Not guilty of manslaughter. Not guilty of leaving the scene. The only conviction, operating a vehicle under the influence, for which she received 1 year of probation. Standard for a first-time offense. Outside the courthouse, the crowd erupted. People who had waited for hours in the June heat screaming, crying, chanting her name. Karen Reed walked down the courthouse steps, placed her hand on her chest, and made the American Sign Language sign for "I love you," which had become the silent symbol of her supporters throughout both trials. She had been fighting for 3.5 years. She had never stopped saying she was innocent. And 12 people agreed. But here is where this story refuses to give you a clean ending. Because John O'Keefe is still dead, and nobody has been charged with his murder, Karen Reed was acquitted. That is not the same as the truth being established. It means the prosecution did not prove its case. It means there was reasonable doubt. Whether that doubt existed because Karen Reed truly did not do it, or because Michael Proctor so thoroughly contaminated the investigation that a fair prosecution became impossible, is a question the justice system of Massachusetts has now permanently failed to answer. The people who were inside 34 Fairview Road that night have never been charged with anything. Brian Albert, the officer who owned the house, who sold it and got rid of his dog after the incident, has always denied any wrongdoing. A Netflix documentary on this case has been announced. It will reach tens of millions of viewers. It will ask the same questions that 2 trials and 3 years of litigation could not resolve. Because at the center of all of it, beneath the corruption, the cover-up allegations, the pink shirts, and the courthouse crowds, is a man named John O'Keefe, who was left in the snow on the morning of January 29, 2022, who died alone, and for whom, as of today, no one has ever been held responsible. So where does that leave us? Karen Reed is free, living her life. She has filed a civil lawsuit for wrongful prosecution. Michael Proctor is fighting to get his job back, while simultaneously insisting he did nothing wrong. The Albert family calls Karen Reed's acquittal, in their words, a devastating miscarriage of justice. And John O'Keefe's case sits in a file somewhere in Massachusetts, officially open, practically cold. This case will not stay quiet. Netflix will make sure of that. And when the documentary drops, and the searches spike, and the country starts asking these questions all over again, I need you to remember one thing. You heard this story here first. Drop in the comments. Do you think Karen Reed was framed? Or do you think she got away with it? Because I have read everything on this case, and I genuinely cannot tell you with certainty which one is true. And I think that is the most honest thing I can say. If this is your first time on this channel, we are here every week for the stories the world moves past too quickly, the women the headlines forget, the cases that never get the ending they deserve. Subscribe, because what's coming next is going to make this one look like a warm-up.